What is Buddhism? Let's talk about it.
Now, today we're going to talk about Buddhism. 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 Try it, please. Don't try to cling. The positive cannot exist without the negative. And as a result of this, by the name of Gautama, the Buddha Siddhartha, a method for the transformation of consciousness.
Hello, and welcome to Please Enlighten Me, a podcast about Buddhism for the 21st century. I am your hostess and Bhikkuni. My name is Sailor, and I'm a little nervous, to be honest with you, because this is my first ever episode of recording this podcast, and my first ever try at recording long-form content, I'd say at trying to shoot for an hour. So this is just a little bit new to me. So please forgive me if it sounds a little weird or whatever. Things will change, and really isn't that what we're here to talk about. First off, I want to talk about, well, what is Buddhism? Some people think it's a religion, some think it's a philosophy, some think it's a lifestyle, others think it's just advice. So what is it? Well, it's kind of all four. Let's break this down a little bit. I've written down here on a piece of paper just some basic definitions of what I think these words mean. So let's start with religion. I say that's a deeply held system of belief, often displayed through worship, prayer, communal sites, and it's most often defined by dogma. And dogma is that feeling of religious guilt and shame, of being bound by something bigger than you, that you you must do this. And that's something Buddhism really doesn't have. Buddhism has ways that the Buddha suggests are positive and you should do in order to attain enlightenment or just peace of mind. But there's no really, you must do this. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to. That's what people then say, oh, well, then Buddhism is a philosophy. Well, if you want to, you can ignore it. But if you don't want to, you can, play around with it a little bit. And I think of philosophy as like a rigorously tested thought experiment. And I say that it's connected by a hypothesis and a thesis. And what I mean by this is, like, a hypothesis is the original idea, and the thesis is like the concrete laying out of that idea. So the thesis is the book, and if you think about the statue of the thinker, that's the hypothesis. That's the formulation of the hypothesis. I also say that philosophy is an exploration of morals, society, and moreover, like a general human purpose. That why are we here? What is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of life? Which, that's a different thing entirely, but we can get into that later. Lifestyle is the third one I have written down here, and that's the way in which one lives their life. That's pretty simple, right? And I also say here that preferences and choices combine to result in a social personality. Let's say it like this. If you think about intersectionality, that analytical idea of you have all these different personalities that intersect, and that is what you are. Buddhism is, I don't want to say the opposite of intersectionality. I would say it's the removal of the need for intersectionality. Because what Buddhism basically says is that if you think you are all of these things, no, you aren't. You are this, it's called in Sanskrit the Atman, that which, as Alan Watts says, that which there is no whicher, but it's where we get the word atom and atomic. It's the most basic building block, well, until we split the atom, which we didn't think we could split the atom, and then we split the atom. So anyhow, it worked for 2,000 years, right? And my last one here that I have is advice. One's opinion given on how best to resolve a problem. if, for instance, I said to you, how should I fix my car? You might say to me, well, take it to a mechanic. Because that's the logical advice you would give, because that's based off of your prior knowledge of your lived experience or something that somebody else told you as advice that you're just passing on. Back to the original point, Buddhism is kind of an aggregate of all four of these things. It's not really a religion. It's not really a philosophy. It's not really a lifestyle, and it's not really just advice. It's kind of a little bit of everything. If you go down the Mahayana path and down the Zen path, the nothingness is what you're shooting for. So it's kind of intrinsic in all stages of Buddhism. But when we're talking about Buddhism, what are we even referencing? Because I keep referring to these ideals and different schools, but what do I even mean? In Theravada Buddhism, which is generally considered to be the oldest and most faithful to the original teachings of the Buddha, if you can be originally faithful to the teachings of the Buddha, we have something called the Pali Canon, and it's in Sanskrit called the Tripitaka, and that means the three baskets. You have the three, and then Pitaka is the baskets. So all of these are going to be something Pitaka. And Sanskrit is kind of intuitive in that way. It's both syllabic and phonetic, very easy building blocks, kind of like Japanese, which is one of the reasons why Japanese and Sanskrit worked so well together and took on so well in Japan. But anyhow, I digress. The first basket of the Tripitaka is the Vinaya Pitaka. And that is the basket of discipline. Now, that's just rules and conduct for bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. And all that really means, bhikkhus, is, how do you want to put this? Beggars. There's a Latin term, the mendicant, from the Latin term mendicus, which means to beg for alms or to be poor. And I don't really like that term so much because Latin isn't really the lingua franca of the day. So let's just use beggar. Somebody that asks for something, that doesn't have much, and that asks for something, a beggar. Bhikkhus are male beggars, and bhikkhunis are female beggars. Let's put that easily. So the second basket of the Tripitaka is what we're going to be focusing on majorly, which is the Sutta Pitaka, and that is the basket of discourse. And discourse, as I kind of explains itself, is just dialogues. Talking back and forth, these not stories, not exactly historical events, these kind of just talks, philosophical dialogues. If you think about the dialogues of Plato and of Socrates, this is broken up into different nikayas, and these are volumes or collection. And there's 5 big ones, and they're of various lengths. So, number 1, that's the long discourses. And I'm looking at it right now. I have the Wisdom Publications copy, the Teachings of the Buddha edition, and it is the Long Discourses of the Buddha. And it is a green book, kind of like an green book in my edition. And it says, a translation of the Nikaya, by Maurice Walsh. This is the third shortest, I guess second longest, however you want to put this, of the Wisdom Publication books I have. And it is the first canonically that people list, that most schools will list as the first book of the Sutta Pitaka. And the second book is the Majjhima Nikaya, which is the middle-length discourses or the medium-length discourses. And this is, ironically, one of the longer ones, but not the longest, because that would be the Samyutta Nikaya, and that is 2,000 pages long in my edition, which is, it's a lot. And the fourth one is the Anguttara. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Anguttara, yeah. I've got to pronounce this right so that I can teach you guys properly. Or not really teach you, but communicate it properly. That's a better way of putting it. Let me say it that way. Communicate it properly. Angutara. If you can't figure it out, the way I have always done it is break it into 2-letter or 2-syllable chunks. So if I look at this word, A-N-G-T, I can't even spell. A-N-G-U-T-T-A-R-A. Angutara. Doesn't that sound wonderful? But what that means, Angutara, is they are one additional, like 1 plus 1. So if you have 1, then the next one is 2, but it's 1 plus 1. It's a kind of not outdated concept of numbering, but it's an ancient way, at least a Vedic way of trying to number scriptures. So it's a bit foreign to us today, but that's the way they worked back then. And the last one is the Kudaka, and this is the minor scriptures. And you would think that the minor scriptures would be the shortest book. No. This is everything else. This is the Buddhist grab bag. This has everything you could ever want and more and what you don't want. And I want to say this now. Buddhist scriptures kind of are like, my favorite Buddhist phrase is pointing at the moon. It's the finger that points at the moon. It's not the core teachings. We're going to go over the core teachings today because it's essential to understanding the rest of Buddhism. But the core teachings are, I almost want to say, profoundly simple in how easy they are to understand. But the rest of it serves a purpose, or it served a purpose, and it continues to serve a purpose. And that purpose was to be repeated, to be memorized, to be understood, to be chanted, to be said aloud in the original languages of Sanskrit and Pali. And the first one was Sanskrit, and it's a bit of a harder tongue than Pali. Pali is a softened palate of Sanskrit. And so let's take, for instance, everybody's favorite 90s band, Nirvana. That is a Sanskrit word, and that's the infinite bliss that everyone is trying to attain through enlightenment. However, the Pali word for it, and what you'll encounter most of the time in the Pali canon, is Nibbana. And that's a softened version of Nirvana. And it's kind of like how some English words are softened version of German words. Like, I can't even think of one. Anyhow, back to what we were talking about. Oh, good grief. Okay. The last basket of the Tripitaka is the Abhidhamma Pitaka. And that is the basket of higher doctrine and teaching. And that is basically like the next level teachings. And what's interesting about this is that it's not really published so far, like in book form, like in a major way as the Sutta Pitaka is. And I should mention that some of my sources that I use are a Wisdom Library. That's an online website, and you can find that at wisdom.org. And Sutta Central, and that's one word, Sutta Central, SUTTACENTRAL.net. And both of these websites have been like majorly helpful to me, because when I couldn't afford the books, I would go to these websites, and this is where I would find the scriptures and read them in plain English. So it's kind of, I'm so grateful to be a 21st century Buddhist where I don't have to learn Sanskrit and Pali right off the bat. I can understand the teachings and kind of work up my way bit by bit. And it's a lot more accessible if you do it that way, if you start learning about Buddhism that way. Obviously, the traditional way is to go to a temple and speak to a teacher and go through the whole student-teacher process and learn and learn and learn until you become a fully ordained bhikkhu. That is the old-fashioned way. That is the way and I don't mean old-fashioned in a bad way. That's just the traditional way of doing it in all three schools of Buddhism. And that was the way that Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, taught his school. So it makes sense. But for some people, it's a little hard. And I don't mean like accessing it. Physically, sometimes it is hard for people to access it. People with disabilities or people with anxiety disorders that just don't want to go there. But also, it can be challenging to just jump into going to a temple for the first time and trying to understand it all, because there are a lot of things that, at least from my perspective, when I first went to my first temple, it was like I saw things and I didn't understand it, but I was just taking it in. I wasn't trying to understand it. I guess subconsciously I was trying to understand it, but I just felt that everything that was there had a purpose for being there, and people understood that purpose. And I would, at some point, if I continued to study this and continued to learn and was diligent in my practice, I would understand this too, eventually. So, I just kind of took it not for granted, but just took it as the way it is. Little did I know that was very helpful in understanding Buddhism in general. But yes, so what we're talking about here is this idea of gathering wisdom. And you don't really have to gather it in the form of books and hoarding an entire library. It's more word of mouth, and how well can you digest it and hold on to it and retain this knowledge, and like not just retaining this knowledge on a surface level. But there's a novel by Robert Heinlein called Stranger in a Strange Land that uses the word grok, like a fully understood teaching, like a fully understood concept. You understand it from every angle, every single different way you could see it. It is understood by you. And again, what you is one thing versus what you think you is. But but knowledge is internalized. Regardless of where you think the self is, knowledge is internalized within you in the brain. The brain is the body's library in that sense. It has to stick with you. And however it sticks with you, as people say, Dharma doors. There are millions and millions of Dharma doors, but they all lead to enlightenment. So however it sticks with you, no matter what you believe. Now, some people are going to argue with you and say one way is more correct than another way. But regardless of what you believe about Buddhism, as long as you hold what the Buddha held as his central core tenets and remove all the fluff, just those central core tenets make you a Buddhist or make you a practitioner of Buddhism. Now, you can be a lay person, as the scriptures always say, and that's just a regular old person of the world. And you can be of a different religion even and practice Buddhism. It's the most open religion, I would say, that I've ever found, besides probably like a pagan or just general paganism or animism or something like that. That's just very broad umbrella. But specifically, Buddhism is accepting. Buddhism is about accepting you at where you are and bringing you up, not bringing you down. One of my problems being brought up in an Abrahamic religion, I was brought up in evangelical Christianity was that its original statement is, one, God exists, two, you've pissed God off because of original sin. Okay, well, regardless of what the snake did, or what the woman did, or what the man did, original sin, the concept of original sin, it just doesn't make sense. Because if you are born, some people say babies are born innocent and then they're baptized and they're really innocent. If you're born innocent and you're born with this original sin in the baptism, like, you're not aware of your original sin, and the baptism is what consecrates you in the Lord, let's just say. What about that necessitates original sin? You could still acknowledge the Lord your God and not have sin, but humans make mistakes, and this is what is called sinning. And so the first mistake is the original sin, and all humans, by Christian doctrine, are born with this original sin. And that's why Judaism isn't correct to the Christian mind, because it doesn't take care of the problem of original sin. It just remediates it and avoids it. And what Christianity imposes is that Christians can avoid that and completely just bypass it with Jesus, and confess and do all that kind of Catholicism stuff of repentance. But at least in evangelical Christianity, it's a lot more, how do I want to say this? It's a lot more touch and go. You can just pray and then, hey, it's gone. And I feel so much better. It's a weight off my shoulders. The yoke is off of me and given unto the Lord. And I don't know how much I believe that. So I left and I tried just about everything. And in high school, I found Buddhism, and ever since, that's been, oh, how long has that been? 6 years now. Well, anyhow, let's get back to what we were talking about. What is Buddhism? To understand that, I'm going to have to give you a little history lesson in ancient Indian history. So let us travel back to the 6th century BCE. In a little place called Northern India, there existed a regional clan named the Shakya clan. And they live in what is modern day the Nepal-Uttar Pradesh border. And they are right behind the Siwalik mountain range and just below the Himalaya. There was, at that time, something called the Ganga Sangha, which is this kind of democratic republic oligarchy thing. Basically, you had the Brahmin, who were these ruler lords, the nobles of society, as you would call them in English terms, I would guess. And these were the clan leaders, kings that had money, regional land, and power, but they weren't really kings. They were just kind of statesmen, kind of like senators today. And they would come and meet at the Sangathagara, which is the council hall, their kind of senate hall, and they would make laws, decide on societal customs and such, and then impose those judiciously, somewhat, on the caste system. And this was a Vedic tradition in India. It was just frequently done. It was how these kinds of governments were run. But the problem with that is that the caste system puts at the top your sages and your ascetics, who are these kind of above society thinkers. They can influence society, but society should really have, because of their thought processes, they have abandoned society because of their beliefs, let's put it that way. But the Brahmin have definite impact on the caste, which has poor, which has wanderers, which has families and workers and farmers and just about everybody else. And it also has dead people. And during that time, there were a lot of dead people because medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, that was basically practiced throughout most of India, it worked, but it wasn't as strong or as well understood as medicine today, and definitely not taught in schools the same way. And so you had a bigger gap of knowledge. People were dying easier, and people were living long, but usually there was a lot of pain and suffering. And suffering is the main word that Buddhism is concerned with. The king of the Shakya clan, let's talk about him. His name is Suddhodana. He's the biological father of the Buddha. And, well, again, who is the Buddha? Well, he's the son of Mahamaya and Suddhodana. And his name, historically, is Siddhartha Gautama. Now, we don't know if he was a real person, to be sure, just as much as we don't know that Jesus or any of the apostles were real people. But what we do know is that he had enough of an impact and enough of a presence that after he died, people wrote about him in the term the Buddha, a Sanskrit adjective which means the enlightened one. And the term in Pali is Tathagata, and that also means the enlightened one. So you can use either one, but most people will call him the Buddha because of Buddhism. But his name is Siddhartha Gautama, and he is the son of two human parents, and he himself is human. He is nothing more and nothing less than a human being born into royalty and privilege. He has a half-brother. His name is Nanda, and his mother is Maha Prajapati. She's the sister of Mahamaya, and she's the Buddha's aunt. All of these names will be coming back into use. So if you don't remember them, just hold on. I have written down here the entire Buddha family tree from the beginning of the Shakya clan up into the Buddha's son, Rahula. There are some family friends of Subhodhana and Mahamaya, and they are the Pañcavaggiya. And that just means the group of five or the band of five. And these are 5 ascetic monks who were Vedic scholars of the time, and they were advisors to the Shakya clan. Well, I should say they were advisors, and their fathers were advisors to the Shakya clan. And in fact, when the Buddha was born, there were 8 of them that had gone to the Buddha's naming festival after Mahamaya died. Oh, I should mention, Mahamaya died 8 days after the Buddha was born, and that became a real problem because who was going to take care of the Buddha? Well, it wasn't definitely going to be his king father, Suddhodana, so it was Maha Prajapati, his aunt. And therefore, Nanda becomes his kind of brother, but half-brother. So instead of a cousin, there were 8 Brahmins. I said that earlier, and I should have said that again. There are 8 Brahmins, and the youngest one's name is Kondana. And Kondana, well, that's in Pali, I should say. His name in Sanskrit is Kwandinya. He's the youngest of these 8 Brahmins, and he is at Siddhartha's naming festival because he's been asked to give a presiding over the Buddha, over this young, well, why is he so special again? There's a guy named Asita, and he's old. And I do mean old, because he was old when Suddhodana was young, because he worked for Suddhodana's father, who was leader of the Shakya clan before Suddhodana. Asita has this, let's call it a prediction. He hears the divine voice, interpret that how you want, but he hears the divine voice, and that voice says, the son of Suddhodana is going to be the remover of suffering. Pretty big prediction. And when Kwandinya hears this, he's kind of upset because he's been working his entire life to achieve this goal, and this baby just kind of gets born into it. So he forms a group, let's say, with the sons of these 8 Brahmin, and they become known as the Panka, the 5, Vaggiya, which means belonging to the party of. And we already talked about this earlier, but good to reiterate it. Now, the 5 are Asaji, which is his Pali name, and his Sanskrit name is Ashvajit. Ashvajit, or Asaji. He is one of the most stubborn students the Buddha will ever encounter. Besides our other one, who is Mahanama, and in Sanskrit, he's Mahanaman. But together they make up these kind of bullheaded students who are just very not into Siddhartha Gautama. Well, until they are, but we'll get to that. So, our third one of these 5 ascetics is Vapa, also known in Sanskrit as Vashpa. He's the son of a Brahmin, and he initially rejects the Buddha. And Badiya or Badarika in Sanskrit. And he's a good friend of somebody who we're going to meet probably later, and his name is Anaruddha. These are the 5. These are the 5 that leave. These are the 5 that cannot stand the fact that the Buddha was born. And so they become ascetics. And they become ascetics for 29 years. Peacefully, I should say. They do their ascetic thing. They are living the Vedic life. They are starving themselves. They are eating non-solid food. They are sitting around by a fire, staring into it and hoping to see the face of death. It is a tough, as the Buddha says, self-mortifying way of living. So all the while they're doing this, the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, is living the palatial life. He is, because his mother is dead and his dad wants to give him everything that he didn't have, or did have, and wants his son to have double of, he's giving him elephant rides, horse rides, chariots. He's giving him women and wives. He's giving him money and food, and it's a little too much. And so, 29 years old, after getting a woman pregnant and fearing his son's birth, he runs away. Now, this has been the debate for hundreds of years now. Why did the Buddha run away? Why didn't he stay and talk it out? And people think, the main reason anyhow, is that if he would have stayed, if he would have talked to his wife, Yashodhara, he would have been convinced to stay. And then none of it would have happened. It was his Dhamma, or in Sanskrit, Dharma. It was his destiny, his path. It was what he had to do. But I want to give some hope for the light at the end of the tunnel here. Everybody meets up in the end, and everybody works it out. So don't worry. He does leave, but it works out. And when he does leave, this is called the Great Renunciation. He chops off all of his hair and goes peach fuzz and becomes a Vedic ascetic for 6 years. And this is the ascetic training of Siddhartha Gautama. And he becomes like the 5. He starves himself. He begs. He eats non-solid food, which is something he wasn't used to. And he doesn't wear fancy clothes, which is something he wasn't used to. And it's kind of working and it's kind of not working. And for 6 years, we're kind of going between the extremes of loving it and hating it. And then finally, after one day, after 6 years, he just gets up and says, "You know what? I want solid food." Oh, it's great, isn't it? He says, "I want solid food." And who should see him eat solid food but Vashpa? And being the son of a Brahmin and being a scholar and being for 30 years, well, actually, I should say for 35 years now, dedicated to this life of asceticism, seeing Siddhartha break it. I mean, how can you describe the anger? He's so angry, in fact. He says, "Well, you absolutely can't be part of our group." And so he leaves. The Buddha says, "Well, I'm not going to be a problem here." And so he walks away. And for 7 weeks, he sits under a tree, the Bodhi tree, one of the most famous symbols in all of Buddhism. He sits under it. And for 49 days, 7 weeks, the 35-year-old Siddhartha Gautama thinks and thinks. And he thinks a lot, and it works. What did he do? How? What? How do you sit for 7 weeks and attain enlightenment? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. In the third Nikaya, in the Samyutta Nikaya, the connected Nikaya, it is subsection 11 of part 56 of book 5 of the Samyutta Nikaya. And it is called Setting in Motion the Wheel of the Dhamma, or the Buddha's First Sermon. I will read it to you as translated by Bhikkhu Bodhi from my copy here that I have annotated. And you are free to read along. It is on page 1843. It begins, I should say, on page 1843. And you will see here at the top, it says, "Setting in Motion the Wheel of the Dhamma." So I am going to read. "Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One, the Buddha, the Shakyamuni Buddha, by the way, was dwelling at Varanasi, and this is in the northern Ganges region of India, and now it's called Varanasi, by the way. But in Varanasi, at the Deer Park, which is northeast of the modern-day town of Varanasi by 8 kilometers, and it was then known as Sarnath. If you're H.P. Lovecraft fans, you'll recognize that name, and that's where he pulled it from. But at Isipatana, and this is the area historically, this is the historical name for the area. There, the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus of the 5 groups thus: "Bhikkhus, these 2 extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness. What to? The pursuit of sensual happiness in sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, and unbeneficial." I should mention, this is what he thinks of his palatial life before his renunciation. "And the pursuit of self-mortification is the other one, which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial." And this is what he thinks of the Vedic asceticism. Now, think about how angry the ascetics are when they hear this. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata, there is that Pali adjective again, meaning the enlightened one, the Tathagata has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, and to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, and to nibbana. And what bhikkhus is the middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, so on, and which leads to Nibbana? It is this noble eightfold path. That is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. I obviously don't have right concentration right now. The Buddhist teachings start thus. The Eightfold Path, which is right understanding, samadhita in Sanskrit, right thought, samasankappa, right speech, samavaka, right action, samakamanta, right livelihood, sama ajiva, right effort, sama vayama, right mindfulness, samasati, and right concentration, sama samadhi. So that is the Eightfold Path, and they're all connected. And the spoke of the Eightfold Path, as you could say, is the Four Noble Truths. What are the Four Noble Truths? Well, this is what the Buddha is about to say. The Four Noble Truths. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering. Aging is suffering. Illness is suffering. Death is suffering. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. We will discuss what the five aggregates are later because we're already learning along, but regardless. Now, this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving and the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance on it. Now, this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. It is this eightfold path. That is right view, right concentration. So, cyclical. Do you see that? The Four Noble Truths are suffering exists, dukkha exists, suffering has a cause, samudaya, suffering has an end, nirodha, and the Eightfold Path is how you get there. Marga in Sanskrit. So, the rest of the Buddha's first sermon is an instructive repetition, broken down in 12 parts, basically, of how to attain enlightenment. And I am going to refer to The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching by Thich Nhat Hanh right now. And on page 30 of my copy of that book, there is a diagram here explaining the 12 turnings of the wheel of the Dhamma. And the first noble truth is suffering, as I said, dukkha. And the recognition of that is this is suffering. The encouragement is suffering should be understood. And the realization is suffering is understood. The Buddha understood suffering, so it's been understood. So realize that there is some encouragement, Arising of suffering is what's listed as the second noble truth, which samyutta, I have, suffering has cause, but, that works too. Recognition is there is an ignoble way that has led to suffering. There's a bad cause. Encouragement is that ignoble way, that bad cause should be understood, can be understood, is the realization it is understood. And the cessation of suffering, which leads to well-being, which is nirodha, that whole idea, is Thich Nhat Hanh is here. Well-being is possible. Well-being should be obtained, and well-being is obtained. It has been obtained, and if you feel good right now, you are in well-being. So there you go. You already obtained it. And the fourth noble truth, how well-being arises, Thich Nhat Hanh has here, is recognition. There's a noble path that leads to well-being. And encouragement, this noble path has been lived. It has been lived on. And the realization is that there are people living on it right now. And I think that we should look at the ending here. After this long passage of scripture that is supposed to be memorized and repeated by monks, chanted for the repetition to learn it, we get this passage. So long, bhikkhus, as my knowledge and vision of these four noble truths, as long as they are in their 3 phases and 12 aspects, were not thoroughly purified in this way, I did not claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed, perfect enlightenment of this world with its Deva, Mara, and Brahma. So we should talk about this. So Devas, Mara, and Brahma are it's a phrase, a metaphor employed by the Buddha. How should I say this? It's a representative phrase. It both means Devas, Mara, and Brahma, as in the Vedic understanding of them and the understanding of them at the time, but also it's a metaphor to mean religions as a whole, delusion, because that's what Mara is. Mara is illusion, so it's this deluded thinking. And then government, Brahma, Brahman, you see the connection there. So in this generation with its ascetics and its Brahmins, there you go, there's the connection that the Buddha makes, and its Devas and its humans. But when my knowledge and vision of these four noble truths, as they really are in their 3 phases and 12 aspects, was thoroughly purified in this way, then I claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed, perfect enlightenment of this world with its Devas, Mara, and Brahma in this generation of its ascetics and Brahmins, its Devas and humans, the knowledge and vision arose in me. Unshakable is the liberation of my mind. This is my last birth. And that's this idea of parinirvana, which is the last death before you achieve nirvana. And realizing this is what makes him the Buddha, like the teacher, is that he was the first one to realize this out of all the other people. So therefore, that makes him the enlightened one, the Tathagata, the Buddha. So he goes on to say, now there is no more renewed existence. This is his last cycle of rebirth. This is the last time he will ever have to be reborn and go through this cycle of samsara in Sanskrit, which is the cycle of birth and death and all that Vedic understanding of reincarnation. And that's the ending of the Buddha's teaching, the official teaching, I should say. The next little chunk is the effect of the teaching, and it says, this is what the Blessed One said, and this is referring to the end of the teaching. Elated, the bhikkhus of the group of 5 delighted in the Blessed One's statement, and while the discourse was being spoken, there arose in the venerable Khandana, we remember Khandana, the dust-free, stainless vision of the Dhamma, and he thinks this: whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. Put another way, whatever is born dies. So this is his big, this is the moment when, in English we would put it as he enters the stream. This is when he starts his path onto enlightenment. And the next part here is a mythological implication, because it mentions that there are these earth-dwelling devas that cry out once the wheel of the Dhamma, once this teaching has been spun. It says that this cannot be stopped by any ascetic or Brahmin or Deva or Mara or Brahma or anyone in this world. And this is basically the Pali Canon stating for the first time, or well, I should say, the Buddha both the Buddha and the Buddhist students saying to the entire world, declaring that this is the way to live. Nobody can stop me from living this way because there's nothing wrong with living this way. Nobody in heaven or earth or hell can stop me from living in a way that doesn't hurt anybody or myself. That's basically what this next chunk implies. And so I'm going to, not disrespectfully, but I am going to skip it to the point where it says, this last paragraph, which is what I want to focus on. Then the Blessed One, the Buddha, uttered this inspired utterance. Kundana has understood. Kundana has indeed understood. In this way, the Venerable Kundana has acquired the name Anna Kundana, Kundana who has understood. And that's the end. So what does that all mean? What did Kundana understand? That everything that is born dies? Is that just what the teaching of the Buddha is? No, because the teaching of the Buddha is the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So why that? Why whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation? Well, that, unfortunately, is going to have to be the content of our next episode, because the idea of dependent origination, I mean, that's a whole other concept in and of itself. So thank you for joining me for this first episode of Please Enlighten Me. And I've had an amazing time recording this and talking to you guys, however many or wherever you are, about this just interesting, not only part of history, but this interesting thought process that has been continued and passed down for hundreds of thousands of years, that has stayed virtually the same. That we haven't even gotten into the meditation practice that goes hand in hand with Buddhism, that derives itself from these Vedic practices that the five were practicing, that the Buddha learned, and we'll get into that a little bit next time too. But already we've covered a lot of ground, and I just want to thank you for giving me your time and allowing me to share the information with you, because really it's not new information. As I've said multiple times, this is not at all new information. This has been just, regurgitated so many times and memorized that it becomes second nature. But a lot of us just don't realize that this exists in the West. And I don't know exactly how prevalent it is in the mind of Eastern cultures at every single moment, but intentionality is not really the Western way. It's kind of shoot first, ask questions later. So I like seeing the differences in ancient culture, not only just in Western and Eastern ancient cultures, but just in difference to society today, because things, as much as they stay the same, they change, and this, as much as it stayed the same, has changed in various ways. And to see how it changes and to see what changes and why it changes, I mean, that's a journey in and of itself. So that's really one of the big reasons that I even enjoy studying Buddhism, is just to experience it. And I hope that you've had fun experiencing it with me. So until next time, thank you for joining me. I have been Sailor, and this has been Please Enlighten Me. Have a good day.